All right, so here's our help video for 4.6. Again, you don't necessarily have to use my approach to factoring, but find an approach that's getting you the right answer the absolute most often. You don't have to show as many steps as I do, but if you are having trouble, it might be worth trying my approach. All right, so number 26. Nothing I can factor out of every piece, so I go ahead and start my first term times last term process. I get 12r squared, and then what two values are going to multiply to be 12r squared and equal 8r when they're added together, 6r and 2r. Again, whether I put the 6r first or the 2r first doesn't matter. At my next step, I know that I'm going to then group my terms. From the first group, I can factor out 2r, leaves me with 2r plus 3. We always factor something out. Second group, all I can factor out is a 1, but I've got my matching group of 2r plus 3. My remaining values, 2r plus 1. Number 27, I've got variables in every piece, but I don't have the same variable in every piece, so I can't factor anything out in terms of the variable. No common factors between 6, -7, and -3. So again, I start my process. 6x squared times -3y squared gets me -18x squared y squared. And so what two factors of -18 add up to -7? -9 and 2. And I break up my x squared y squared into xy's. So I split my middle term, form my first group, form my second group. I can take out a 3x from my first group. Only thing I can take out from my second group is a y. But I've got my matching group 2x minus 3y, and that leaves over 3x plus y. 28, again, not able to factor anything out at the beginning of the problem, so I go ahead and get right to work. I'm looking for factors of -30 s squared t squared that add back together to be just st, and that happens to be 6xt and -5st. Again, I know my s's look like 5s. I try to emphasize my 5s. Sorry about that. I've split my middle term. I form my two groups. For my first group, I factor out 6s. Second group, don't forget to always bring the negative out as well. It's going to change my sign so that my signs match. So I've got s plus t and s plus t, leaving me with 6x minus 5t for my second group. 29, again, can't factor something out of everything, so I get right to work with my first term times my last term. What two values multiply to be -30 but add back together to be 7? Well, that's 10 and -3, and of course I split up my h squared and k squared for hk. Split my middle term, form my groups. For my first group, all I can factor out is an h. For my second group, I can take a 5k, but has made my two groups match. So I factor out my matching group, make a group out of what is left over. Still not able to factor anything out of everything. So I get right to work, multiply my first term times my last term. What multiplies to be -42 but adds back together to be 1? Well, 7 and -6 do. Again, splitting my u squared and v squared for uv's. I split my middle term. Doesn't matter whether I put the 7 first or the -6 first. I form my groups. First group I can factor out a u. Second group I can factor out, again, a -3v. I've got my matching group. I've got my pieces that are left over. I've got my final answer. (31). Still not able to factor something out of everything. Multiply first term times last term. What multiplies to be -60 but adds back to be 7? Well, 12 and -5 do. So I've split my middle term. I group my first two terms, group my last two terms. I'm able to factor out a 6x from my first group. Again, I take the negative with, so that's going to change this to x plus 2. That way my groups match. I have my value that matched, the two terms that are left over. I've got my final answer. All right, I promise things will factor out at the beginning soon. Again, still nothing I can factor out at the beginning, so I get right to work. 4y squared times 15 gets me 60y squared. Since this is positive and my middle term is negative, I know both values I'm going to use to add up to negative 17 are negative. And so negative 12 minus 5. Again, if you try and use the 20 and the 3, double check that 20 and 3 multiply to be positive 60 and add to be negative 17. Okay, there's no way that that's going to work. So I split my middle term, group my first two terms, group my last two terms. All I'm able to factor for my first group is a y. For my second group, I'm able to factor in negative 3. Remember, those signs are going to match, so I bring out negative 3, which changes that to 4y minus 5. I've got my matching group. I've got the terms that I factored out. We have our final answer. All right, 33. I started by multiplying my 4t squared times my 6, and I start trying to look for things that multiply to be 24 but add back to be 9. But if I start going through my process of thinking of my factors, there's nothing that's going to multiply to be positive 24 and add back to be 9. None of these terms are 9 units apart. So number 33 is relatively prime. All right, 34. Multiply my first and last two terms together. Again, the fact that this is a positive 100, but it has to add back to be negative 20, tells me that my two values are going to be negative, and it ends up being negative 10u and negative 10u, which add together to negative 20u. So I split my middle term, group my first two terms, group my last two terms. I'm able to take 5u out of my first term, negative 2 out of my second term. And so I end up with 5u minus 2 times 5 minus y minus 2, or 5y minus 2 quantity squared. All right, 35. I multiply my first term times my last term, I get negative 60p squared q squared. And again, if I start thinking about my values that are going to multiply together to get negative 60 and add back together to get negative 32, well, it does appear that I have values that are separated 3 and 2, but there's no way to get negative 60, whether it's negative 2 times 30 or negative 30 times 2. Neither of these sets are going to add up to negative 32. This would add up, if I added it, I would get 28. If I added this, I would get negative 28. So this problem is also relatively prime. All right, 36. Finally able to factor something out. So I notice that I have all even values, so I take a 2 out at the beginning. I don't end up with a coefficient of 1, so I start my process of factoring, and I get negative 10r squared s squared. So I think of my factors for 10, and none of these values are going to combine to get me 8. So, like that last example in class, this wouldn't be referred to as relatively prime because we were able to factor the 2 out at the beginning of the problem, but we aren't going to be able to factor out the trinomial. 37. I see an x in every term. Since I see an x in every term, I can factor that x out. Once I factor that out, I move my x to the bottom so that I don't forget to include it in my final answer. I start my factoring process, first term times last term. What two numbers multiply to be negative 20, but add back to be 8, 10 and negative 2. So I split my middle term, make my groups, take 2x from my first group. All I can take out of my second group is a negative y. Again, remember those signs are going to match. I've got matching 2x plus 5y, left over 2x minus y, and then there's my x from the beginning so I don't forget it in my final answer. $38. I'm not able to factor something from everything. So I multiply my first term times my last term, I get negative 60. And again, I start thinking about what of the values that multiply together to be 60 can add back together to be 3. Oh, I skipped 5 and 12, sorry. All right. None of these values are 3 units apart, so none of those are going to work. 38 is relatively prime. All right, 39. I notice that I can take 4 from every term. There's also p's and q's in every term, so I can take out a p and a q, leaving me with a difference of cubes. Again, whether you take the time to rewrite so you can recognize what your a and your b values are, in this case a is q, 2 is b, but I don't want to forget about what I factored out at the beginning. I've got a minus b, a squared, plus a times b, plus b squared. I've got my answer. Remember, the trinomial at the end of a sum or difference of cubes will not be factorable. And finally, number 40. So I know that I can take a 3 from 81 and from 3, but I also see u's in each term, so I take out a 3u. Don't forget to include it in that final answer. That's going to leave me with 27v cubed plus u cubed. And again, if it helps, take the time to write what the value cubed is. That lets me recognize a, lets me recognize b. 3u from the beginning, what I factored out at the beginning, a plus b times a squared minus a times b squared. And again, that trinomial at the end of a sum or difference of cubes will not be factorable. All right, hopefully this has helped. If you still have questions, definitely feel free to ask in class. Like I say, hopefully factoring is starting to come together. If you still have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Don't hesitate to come to office hours. See you soon.